everybody. I'm delighted to open this session. So my name is Henri Malos. I'm a former president of European Economic and Social Committee, still a member of this honorable institution, and honorary chairman of Vocal Europe. As you know, and I thank you for having accepted this invitation, Vocal Europe is a research institute dedicated to focus on Balkans, the Western Balkans, Russia, Iran, Middle East, and Turkey, and its main task is to promote European values in international relations and in cooperation action. So through research studies, workshops, study trips, and conference like this conference, Vocal Europe is promoting this value and giving information and exchange of opinion in Brussels and in all Europe, and in the sense of large Europe. But let me first speak about our concern or even today. First of all, I'm very delighted to introduce the panel. They will be introduced by our moderator here. But I'm particularly delighted that my friends, Mr. Lewandowski, former commissioner, president, chairman of the committee of the European Parliament, and Pierre Vimont, who is a friend for some years, 30 years, something like that. He's here, and Mr. Ernst, member of the European Parliament, is here with us. The relation between Iran and each EU member state had changed over time. They were quite difficult in the past. They improved a lot until 2002. 2003, we had this debate, tensions around the nuclear issues. And finally, after the deal was signed on the nuclear questions, those relations have drastically improved. And we have started again to see some European investment, European companies coming to Iran and investing in Iran, notably the case for example, because I'm French, for French company, with German company, UK company, Italian company, Spanish company, a lot of others. At the same time, so we have this situation came in difficulty, of course, by the decision of the Trump administration to step down from the nuclear deal. And this is the main reason of our session today, is to have another look and a debate about the questions: what are EU and Tehran's strategic interests in preserving the nuclear deal? The question about the American sanctions, not exactly about, in my view, the question about the American sanctions, but the question about the consequence of these sanctions. Can we accept, for example, that the US impose to non-American companies its national law outside of its territory? Is the European Union, the European companies, European member states ready to accept that or not, despite a certain number of decisions, of engagement that the European Union will stick to its own signatures to the Iran nuclear deal and will preserve and support the interests of the European companies? So I'm really, as I say, delighted that we have such a distinguished panel here. As I mentioned, Mrs. Cornelia Ernst, Mr. Janusz Lewandowski from the European Parliament, my friend Pierre Vimont, who has a...
I am also your friend.
And, yes, my friend, of course, because we know each other from Poland, from Polish fight for freedom, democracy, and since the time of Solidarność. And Pierre Vimont, as he was my colleague and former councillor at the French Fair Rep, and we set up together an association of French interests. It was a long time ago, but we remain in very good contact all this time. So I'm very happy to launch the debate and to give the floor to Astrid, who will moderate this debate. And thank you for all of us to be here present. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So the topic of our conference today is: can the European Union remain connected to Iran? Well, I should begin with the fact that there is the existence of commercial and diplomatic standoff which exists between the United States and the EU, with the US withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the 8th of May, and the reinsertion of US secondary sanctions vis-à-vis Iran. So the Iranian nuclear deal may be considered as one of the last cornerstones preserving the non-proliferation treaty from collapsing, and the EU is actively defending it. And because it's one of its most successful diplomatic achievements of its diplomacy. So the Iranian nuclear agreement is both a founding case of the foreign policy of the European Union, which has become too economically powerful for the US, as well as an obstacle to the US energy ambitions in the Middle East. So what may be interpreted now as a diplomatic failure with commercial spin-offs for the EU is in fact the result of the economic power that the EU represents for the US. Because the EU now is faced with a diplomatic and commercial dilemma, because it has to deal with an American partner with whom the daily volume of trade makes really Washington essential and irreplaceable. But at the same time, there is the willingness of the US to break the agreement on the grounds that it doesn't cover the thorny issue of the ballistic missile issue. So the self-proclaimed extraterritoriality of the US sanctions are intending to deprive global companies from trading in Iran, and it really reveals the American will to curb the EU's trade expansion. So the EU is really committed to defend its business opportunities of its companies in Iran, and its political response is, of course, the famous adoption of a legal protection mechanism vis-à-vis US sanctions. And it represents a political response symbolizing the EU's refusal to support or validate the US withdrawal from the deal, the commercial fight delivered to the EU by the US, as well as the Tehran's isolation advocated by Washington and Riyadh. So on 16 2018, the European Commission adopted a delegated act to update the annex to the blocking regulation adopted in 1996 to circumvent US sanctions against Cuba. It was approved by foreign ministers on 16 June 2018, and this act prohibits European companies from complying with these US sanctions. Otherwise, there would be potential penalties set by each member state. And one of the provisions of this mechanism is to award compensation to European companies that have been harmed by a legal or moral person which is responsible for it. And in this case, it will be the United States. But however that, the EU may rely on the diplomatic support from Beijing and Moscow to eradicate instability in the Middle East, to secure their own commercial and maritime and energy markets. So in fact, we may consider that President Trump is now confronting the perverse effect of his decision to withdraw because other signatories offer a united front to maintain the 2015 agreement and trade. And in the long run, it's really marginalizing the United States. So now, faced with this diplomatic and economic dilemma, the question is, can the EU remain connected to Iran? So the question will be answered today by Ambassador Pierre Vimont, who is the former Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service, by Mr. Janusz Lewandowski, who is the Chairman of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with Iran, and by Mrs. Cornelia Ernst from the same delegation to the Parliament. This presentation will be divided in 3 rounds, each of 15 minutes, and each round will be followed by a question and answer session of 7 minutes each. So my first question will be to you, Mr. Ambassador. Considering that the Iranian is the diplomatic flagship of the European foreign policy, could you remind us a little bit how the EU foreign policy vis-à-vis Iran has been shaped since 2003, and what is exactly the role of the EU to preserve the deal?
Thank you, first of all. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here again on a panel with you, Astrid, because I remember we were together 1 or 2 years ago discussing already Iran, I must say. It's true to some extent that this nuclear deal with Iran was one of the few flagships of the European foreign policy. There hasn't been a lot, maybe Kosovo also at some stage, but not much more than that. I think what is important to remind the audience is the context of 2003. We were right in the middle of the Western intervention in Iraq, as you know, with 2 countries from the European Union taking a very strong stance against that intervention, namely France and Germany, and one other big country, the UK, Great Britain, being on the other side in support of that intervention. And for the 3 foreign ministers to launch an initiative on the whole issue of the Iranian nuclear program was a way of sticking together and trying to see if they could come out of that confrontation and that polarization they had together. There were many other issues, of course, related to that. The nuclear program of Iran was a worrisome issue, a challenge about non-proliferation that the 3 countries wanted to tackle. There was also the concern that after getting into Iraq, the U.S. administration, this was George W. Bush at the time, would follow on with Iran after Iraq. The interesting point from this perspective, for me, is twofold. Is that in spite of Washington objections, 3 member states from the European Union decided to go ahead anyway. And I think it's interesting if you try to compare to nowadays. The second point is that having launched that initiative and having been to some extent successful by triggering a new negotiating process with Iran, it was a very difficult initiative to be set up. It took place at the end of the day in a rather dramatic visit to Tehran by the autumn of 2003, where they managed to get an agreement from the Iranian side. By the way, at that time their interlocutor was Rouhani already. All the actors who are here at the moment on the GCPOA were already more or less there at the time. But they managed to get an agreement, and they launched that initiative with the 3 European member states being at the forefront. But the second aspect, which I find quite interesting, is that rather quickly the 3 of them decided that it was important to get a sort of EU coverage. In other words, to ask Javier Solana to come in and to chair the group in order to convince the other member states, we were 15 at the time, that this was really a full-fledged EU initiative and that they had to work together. And compare that with today's Ukrainian crisis and the Minsk process, whereby 2 member states have decided also to launch a diplomatic initiative in relation to the Ukrainian crisis and the Donbass interference of Russia. And therefore they have launched this negotiating process with Russia and Ukraine. Time and again the question was raised by some of the EU member states, the ones that were not involved, how could we get the whole EU involved through the High Representative or by another way or other means, but it never worked out. And the 2 member states decided it was better for them to go along on their own. They had many arguments for that. Russia wouldn't be happy, it would be difficult, it would be too complicated. But it's interesting to see 2003, 2014, 10 years' time, the change of mood and the change of mindset inside Europe. So that's the way it started, really as a EU initiative that was joined afterwards by the Americans, somewhat reluctantly. But with the Obama administration, of course, things changed a lot, and the American administration, by the time of the Obama presidency, thought that this was the right channel to start maybe a sort of confidential bilateral relationship with Iran, and slowly the whole thing went ahead. Russia, China were involved, and we managed by the end of the day 12 years of negotiation to get the agreement at the end. So that's the way it worked. And once again, looking back at this, I'm not sure today in the state European Union is, and the difficulties that we're facing at the moment to launch audacious initiatives, I would say, in the field of foreign and security policy. I'm not sure we could do it again.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes. So now the defense, the European Union is adopting the adoption of this special purpose special purpose vehicle, which is a barter system. So, Mr. Lewandowski, how effective is this special purpose vehicle? Can we still a bit assess it a little bit, or?
Thank you for your invitation. The special vehicle is not yet operational, so we cannot discuss whether this is effective or not. This is a very creative solution to the very difficult challenge. As for the short introduction, we are discussing today the most volcanic area in the world. Very important from the point of view of European security. We are discussing relationship with the strongest economy in the region. I think in GDP terms Saudi Arabia is a little bit more, but this is about oil and gas, while Iranian economy is diversified. They are far much more interesting economic partner for Europe than Saudi Arabia. 80 million people, half of the population under 30 years, rich in gas and oil reserves. And as Mr. Ambassador, I see the nuclear deal as a major achievement of persistent diplomacy. And what's more, also for the Obama administration, I think this was major pillar of his legacy. Apart from perhaps opening of Cuba and nuclear deal with Iran, these were the major achievements of foreign diplomacy of Obama administration. That is important statement, because so much in the decision of Trump administration was against legacy of Obama, and not quite provoked by the changing climate in the Middle East. This was so much against Obama administration. What to do now? I think we should, as nuclear deal was about containing nuclear race. This was not about human rights. This was not about conventional ballistic missiles. This was not about the other issues. This was to contain nuclear race, which was a major danger in this region. And Iran was complying with the conditions of this deal. With unilateral withdrawal of Trump, and on top of this agreement there was a resolution, unanimous resolution of United Nations Security Council on the issue. We have major challenge, because what was promised by the reformist camp in Iran was the economic dividend opening that was about nuclear race, but this was a promise of opening of a country, of business, of tourism, of opportunities for this young generation of Iranians, and they are strongly disappointed. The only, I think, result of what's going now is reinforcing the conservative camp in Iran and not the reformist camp of Iran. I'm also drawing, when seeking solutions, on my own experience. I was in opposition against the communist rule in Poland. Experienced somebody who was against authoritarian or even totalitarian regime. And I believe that the only way to reinforce what is reformist, what is opening, is not about isolation. It's not about, you should have stick and carrot. Sometimes sanctions, but on the other hand, dialogue, opening, multiplying business opportunities. That is the way of dealing really with authoritarian regime, and reinforcing what is a chance, and not reinforcing what are the problems. We should try this special vehicle. That is one of the solution. Of course, updating blocking statute was another one solution, not also very effective. Extending European Investment Bank to Iran as potential eligible country was step number 3. I think not so much it's partially against the will of investment bank. Everything what I don't see the other. I am not very much optimistic right now. We should try. We should simply try. We should, as we are by declaration committed. I mean, Europe is by declaration committed to the deal. We should try all these three solutions, and the special vehicle is the most creative in order to preserve financial transactions and protect the European business, mainly small business. Because all the multinationals, what is of larger scale, is raising money in the American market, so they are so much affected by the potential American sanctions. Give a chance. That is my answer, without much illusions, and also without illusions as to the human rights situations in Iran, as to the destabilizing role of Iran in the Middle East, because this is destabilizing. This is supporting Hezbollah. This is supporting rebels in Yemen. So without these illusions. But as for security of Europe, we should try, and for business of Europe, we should try.
And it's of course a very interesting mechanism, because it's a barter system, which is not going to be very transparent for the US. And Mrs. Ernst, do you think that this mechanism could be a starting point for a broader cooperation mechanism, which may include major international players? Thank you.
Yeah, let me start and add what my colleague from the European Parliament told. I think first of all we have to say, yes, we are interested in a good cooperation with Iran, and it's a very important interest of all in Europe, and we should say that. And if you look which reasons we have for that, we are Mr. Zarif in 2013, when we were in Iran, in Tehran, he told us, Europeans, we are neighbors. We are neighbors. If you look in the history, if you look in the present, and all problems in Iran are also problems more or less in Europe. And I think we have a common history with Iran. We have a neighborship. We have a lot of economic interests, and we have interests in the human rights problematic. We know this is very, very it's not easy to work in this point, also because we are working with double standards as Europeans, yes. If we speak about Iran, it's another thing than if we speak about maybe violation of human rights in the US or other countries. Okay, we know this problem, and I say that because I think we should fight for the JCPOA. It's very important to do it. I know the situation is very problematical, but we should do it because we can prepare a new basis for the relationship between Iran and Europe. So, and if you look at the so-called SPV, is it a possibility to come to a cooperation between the companies in Iran and Europe? Yes, I think so. But we have some problems. The banking sector. What can we do in a situation where we have US sanctions and no access to the international banking sector? This is not so easy. The big companies will say, oh no, we don't go to Iran, then we will have problems with the US. And this is a problem we have to discuss. Also, we have the problem of the liability. It's an open problem if we speak about that. But I think the Commission, and I'm looking for the Commission to make a proper proposal on that, supported from other countries like Germany, China, France, UK. They are all interested, also Japan, and I think yes, we should look for such a cooperation, a new version of import-export between EU and Iran. And again, we have to speak about the banking sector, and I think also about trust. We know the companies in Iran are not the companies in Poland and Germany. Yes, not good Germany. I'm a German, and I shouldn't compare it with Germany. But yes, it's true that a lot of companies say, oh, okay, if we have an involvement in terroristic, in terror financing of these companies, then we will have a problem. Yes, it's true. And my question is, how are the conditions in Iran? How is the influence of Rouhani to prepare conditions for a fair cooperation between EU and Iran? This is not easy, but I think it's the way we should try. I don't know if we have a historical example for that from another region. We should speak about that, and we should look in other areas of our continent where we can use this or another example. I think we should try it. What I'm not support is the proposal we discussed in our delegation I heard about an option such as a whitelist for companies that are not affected with terrorist networks. Okay, who will prepare this whitelist? I don't know. And a certification of companies in Iran, not so easy. I think it's not a realistic version, but we should try it. We need a corridor. We need a broader corridor to come to a cooperation between the entities. But yes, I told you my problems.
Okay, thank you for your answer. We'll now open the first Q&A session. Are there any questions?
Advisors.
Advisors.
Solutions.
It's better, yeah.
Solutions with these.
No, here.
We need it.
How do we do?
I don't think I need a mic,
Okay.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies, which is the think tank of the EP, the European People's Party. So, I have this very simple question. When you talk about moderates in the Iranian context, Mr. Rouhani, for example, and you actually emphasized, Janusz Lewandowski, that there was a deal that in return for the JCPOA, there would be some kind of reformist movement in Iran. What's become of that? What have we seen? How do you assess the demonstrations a year ago against the regime, which were, I mean, I don't know, you could say they were triggered by the CIA, of course. I think that's not very likely. I think they were genuine. There are real disaffections. And so how do you assess that? Was there any light at the end of the tunnel for reform in Iran itself? That was one point. And the other one is, some of you have mentioned the terror plots by Iran on European territory recently. You know, this year, I mean, I could go down the list, you know, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, you know, plotting to kill Jewish children in Germany, for example. Is that a regime that we really want to have a positive, cooperative relationship with? I mean, can we be realistic about what is actually happening in Iran, what Iran is doing to us as we speak, and then discuss our strategy towards that country? That's my question.
Okay, another question?
My name is Danish Ramtau. I'm with the American Jewish Committee here in Brussels. I wanted to ask two questions.
Okay.
There is a sort of a general assessment that this deal is indeed the best that we could do in terms of nuclear proliferation. This, as a questioner, I cannot go into all the details of the problems with the deal, but there is one definitely fundamental flaw, namely that it has an expiration date. That the most important restrictions will now, in about 9 years, expire. And as President Obama himself said in a 2015 interview, that at that date, the nuclear breakout time, meaning the time Iran would need to produce enough fissile material for one nuclear bomb, would basically be zero. What is Europe's answer? And this is one of the main criticisms from the US administration. How do we prepare for this day, which is 9 years, this is nothing. when Iran will be in a better position than it was before the deal, during the deal, and when there would be no possibility, neither militarily nor through sanctions, in any way to intervene if Iran at that point decided to go nuclear. The second point that I wanted to address was Mr. Lewandowski said that this is just about the nuclear file and has nothing to do with missiles. I would beg to differ. When we talk about nuclear proliferation, we always have to look at three things: fissile material, nuclear warheads, and the delivery system. And the delivery system is missiles. And it's not that the JCPOA not just didn't take missiles into consideration. To the contrary, there was a move to rewrite the UN Security Council resolution that existed before the JCPOA and which had a very strict prohibition for any kind of missile test, which was weakened to the extent that Iran can now legitimately say, we can do these tests. What was the rationale behind it? If we talk about European security, to give Iranians the possibility to work on missiles that at the moment already can reach parts of Europe, eventually will be able to cover all of Europe. I never, of all the mystifying elements of the deal, I never understood this element. And now we are chasing behind them and we are giving statements that we don't like the missile tests when we gave them the right to do it. That was, how are we going to address this? And the third issue, as you said, Mr. Lewandowski, we should not be naive to Iran's, what you call, destabilizing actions. Well, it's more than destabilizing. We're talking about ethnic cleansing. We're talking about arming Hezbollah to the teeth, that if there will be another war with Israel, it will be devastating for both Israel and Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And as Roland just said, terror attacks on European soil day after day. What is Europeans' answer? Okay, we keep the JCPOA, but then what?
All right. Who wants to first answer?
Do you want me to answer?
Okay.
I can start. I have plenty to say on these two questions. Maybe starting and adding, joining the two questions together. What seems to be your main criticism is the naivety of the negotiators. And I totally disagree with that. For one simple reason, we went open-eyed into that agreement. A lot of the negotiators knew that there were a lot of shortcomings and weaknesses, not exactly the ones you're talking about, and I'll come back to that in a second. But was it better to have no deal rather than to have a deal that had shortcomings and that was not flawless? By the way, from a diplomatic point of view, I think one of the most difficult sentence I can accept is this idea that it's better to have a no deal than a bad deal. Let's just look at 1 second where we are now with the Brexit because of that sentence. So let's be very careful about that, really. This deal is far from being perfect, and it was said so by more or less all the partners. But at least it allowed us to have a foot into the monitoring of the whole Iranian system. And even there may be flaws, it's still better than to have no monitoring at all, it seems to me. So this is why I never understood why it was better to withdraw from that agreement than to stay in. Really, at least from a purely realistic, factual, diplomatic point of view, for me this is totally not understandable. I don't understand. Second point, on one or two of the flows. First of all, it was never the idea it was the idea, but it was never written anywhere in that agreement that we were creating an immediate virtuous circle. We were very much hoping that by having this deal, we would start something that would slowly move into more stability in the Middle East region. Why did it not work? Because of the reality on the ground. And there I'm one of those who think that we made a major mistake when we negotiated that deal, is that from the beginning, as we did between 2003 and 2005, we should have, by a way or another, get the other regional actors involved in a way or another into that. Because they had the impression right from the beginning that we were hiding something, that we were trying not to tell them what it was. The point there is that once the deal was agreed, And if you look at it from the Iranian point of view, what they have seen, outcry all over the region saying that this was a fraudulent deal, that they would never accept it. Outcry from not only the Republican opposition, but more or less the whole Congress, saying we will never ratify, and they didn't. And as soon as we will be elected, Mr. Trump said, I will get rid of that. You know, you start having second thoughts about moving ahead and trying to look for to be more virtuous, as I was saying, and starting a virtuous circle. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent, if I may say so, and I very much regret it. Once again, I think there are both sides to be blamed for that, the negotiators and Iran, but that's the reality, and I think we have to live with that. On the flow you mentioned with the agreement, the breakup time limit. Sorry, but no experts will tell you that if they start again their program, they can immediately go for a military warhead. What they're telling, which is, by the way, very interesting, is that when before the deal, it was more or less 1 year, even maybe more than that. But with the expertise they have gained, if the deal breaks down and they go ahead, experts talk about 6 to 8 months, but not immediately, really. Yeah, but I can tell you, and I've been discussing that very recently, and from American experts, just as European experts, they're very much stuck to that position, which is, and there I will follow you, maybe frightening, because it's not much, and brings me back to the whole point. Of course we disagree with Iran. We disagree on human rights, we disagree on what they're doing in Syria and Iraq, where their influence is increasing. We don't agree with their partnership with Hezbollah, etc., maybe even to some extent with Hamas. And we don't like what they say time and again, the statements they issue about Israel. On this, I think we all agree. My whole point, and it's a very simple point, and I'll stop there, is then what should we do? Should we go for those who say, let's get out of the deal, let's go for a regime change? We can only work with zero-sum agreements. In other words, I win, you lose, you win, I lose. That's not the way you're going to bring stability back to the region. And that's my whole point. If we go along what I would dare say is a sort of populist diplomacy, you can be sure that we're going to stay with this disorder in the region for many years ahead. So let's try at some point to be adults in the room and start thinking about how we can get out of this mess where we are, where there is a lot of blame to be put on Iran. I totally agree. But where, in my opinion, we have to find a way out without going to those most radical positions, sanctions, military strike. I even hear about that. We've seen that recently. The White House asking for different options on that possibility. I think that would be the wrong way to go.
Yeah, that was exactly my analogy I wanted to use in reply. With all the flows, with all the what can be critical about the nuclear deal, this was maximum what was achievable, what was feasible in 2015, exactly as it is with Brexit deal. Here is a real analogy, whether we are going for that sort of deal, which is a compromise, or without deal. I am really without illusions about the domestic development in Iran. We should see now more and more of ugly face of Iran in Europe, in the region, because but this is not the result of a nuclear deal. This is the result of disappointment, deep disappointment in Iran as to the economic dividend resulting from the deal, and that is really reinforcing conservative camp, and that is why we should see more of ugly face of Iran nowadays. I've seen this younger generation in the streets of Tehran. I remember so-called Arab Spring. Arab is a different world, but one more analogy. When I was in the Commission in 2011, we were monitoring developments in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in the other countries. And what was everything was in the social media, because this was younger generation. And what was interesting was the model of good life. They are really in internet world, and they would like to live normal life. And for them, normal life, for this younger generation in Tunisia and in Egypt, good life was not about Saudi Arabia, not about that sort of regime, neither American, too challenging way of life, not American way of life. Europe was about good life. And this was also my feeling about the streets of Tehran. My major question and my major hope is with this younger generation, how to influence developments in Iran in order to open the way for better life for this younger generation to influence political class and political developments in this huge country. I have no good recipe. I don't see any practical steps by reformist camp. The only small step was perhaps about death penalty for drug trafficking without weapons. This was the only legal action that was accepted in Iran. Not much really. I am pessimistic, deeply pessimistic now, and I see that the domestic developments in Iran, also with influence in the region and this ugly face of Iran elsewhere, that is in sharp contrast with my feeling about what the younger generation of Iranians would like. But these revolts in the streets, and these were also about rural areas, were so much economically motivated, and not about freedom of expression. This was economically motivated. This is the result of deep disappointment. This is also the question and lesson that we should manage expectations. There were too many expectations as for economic dividend, as for economic result of this nuclear deal, and now we have deep disappointment, and deep disappointment is as advantage to the conservative camp in Iran. Mm-hmm. So we are somehow in a trap. But this is contrary what the younger generation, what this demographic bomb of Iran, 40 million Iranians under 30 is expecting from their life. Good life is about Western, more mm-hmm. Western type of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only add, it's true, if we break with a deal, so sorry, now is it a break with the Iranians. And I was in 2013 and in 2017 there, I could see a lot of developments from the youth, but also with other people we could speak, with Armenians, you know that. And they are waiting for us. It's true. And if we say, oh no, now we break down the deal, I think it's a big great disappointment, especially of the people are criticizing the regime in Iran. Yes, and no, I think it would be a wrong way, and it's. I think to think about that. It's. For me, especially for me, complicated. I want to say I come from a closed system. I come from the former GDR, and I know what does it mean. A closed, I know what does it mean to live in a closed country. I know that. How complicated is it for the people? And a lot of people are waiting for opening the country, not only the economy, also the science and medicine, and work together with entities in Europe, and this is also important for the region, Middle East. I think, we need a Middle East balance, and the Americans do not enough for balance. I will be very friendly, and maybe we have here very different interests between the US and the Europeans. Maybe, and this is also our problem.
So after all,
not much of constructive solutions.
No, that's a lie.
There can be constructive solutions. Could I just add one point on sanctions and extraterritoriality? This is not, as was said before, this is not a new issue that we have with the United States. In fact, if you look back at the history of the European Union, we had two major confrontations. One was in, if I remember well, 1982 with Ronald Reagan, the gas pipeline. And very interestingly enough, already at that time, because it was very harsh, all the, we were 10 member states at that time. The 10 member states all decided at the time for national legislation to protect their companies. And even Mrs. Thatcher, by the way, who came up with a very strong UK legislation to protect the British companies against US sanctions. That was the first one. The second one was with the Clinton administration. It was the time when we got this blockade legislation you were talking about. And there, interestingly enough, we managed to avoid confrontation because the Clinton administration accepted the fact that it was not worth going into a confrontation about Cuba. Let's not forget, and that would be my second point, that quite often with the Americans we have seen eye to eye with regard to sanctions, even on the extraterritorial nature of those sanctions. Look at what's going on at the moment with the sanctions related to Russia, to Syria, to many other countries. In fact, if you look at the moment at the list of sanctions that the EU has with a lot of third countries, it's a huge list. We tend to forget that. In Africa, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in
And what
South
is the
America.
effect?
Pardon?
And what is the effect
Yeah.
of that?
That we never know. That's the whole issue of sanctions. I tend to agree with you. But today, in the toolbox of diplomacy, we only have official statements and sanctions. That's more or less what we usually do. But the real difficulty we're having today with the U.S. sanctions is that when this whole process of sanctions started, it was mostly about fighting corruption. Fighting fiscal fraud, fighting money laundering, so on and so forth. The real difficulty now is that the Americans are setting sanctions related to this very vague and imprecise concept of national security. And when we tend to disagree, which is exactly the case with Iran, we don't think that this is a case for national security being threatened, then we find ourselves in this kind of very strong confrontation. By the way, we all are using extraterritoriality. Even the International Court of Justice allows extraterritoriality for sanctions when by way or another there is a close, strong, direct link with your market. What the competition department in the European Commission is doing quite often with Google and others is a lot about extraterritoriality, but it is pushing on issues related to the single market and to foreign companies working on the single market. The problem with the American sanctions, what we call the secondary sanctions, is that they are hitting at companies that are having business with a third country with no link at all with America, except that the money that is being used is the dollar, that at some point you may go to a website that is located somewhere in Texas, and therefore they jump on this and they say, therefore I can act. And unfortunately, that's my personal opinion, I'm not sure that the special purpose vehicle that we're trying to set up, this new financial instrument, will manage to change really the situation, because today the reality in the international economic world is that everybody is doing business with the dollar. In fact, the use of the euro has been decreasing since the financial crisis of 2008. So we have a long way to go before we are able to build up a sort of counter system that will allow us to work without being forced to work on the American market. And this will not happen in 1 or 2 years. It's a long-term strategy.
Yeah, long-term, yes. Okay, so let's open the second round. Mr. Lewandowski, my question will be to you. On 7 January, the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, Real Admiral Ali Shamkhani, declared that the Europeans' opportunity to execute their commitments to our country under the JCPOA, and particularly the Special Financial Channel, has ended. And after all that the EU has been through during the negotiations of 12 years diplomatic marathon, with some phases of great diplomatic progress and then a bit stagnation, the European Union has always been able, to progress whatever the conditions were. So do you think that it could really be the end, as he declared?
This is not the end, and this is not fully justified criticism. This is the expression of frustration of the Iranian side, because all 3 measures were taken. I mean, extending European Investment Bank against their will to Iran as an eligible country, updating blockade statute, and trying what is not yet operational and what could disappoint us with special vehicle. I don't think we can do more, but what we shouldn't do is what my government is doing right now, hosting the security conference on Middle East, really arranged by American side in Warsaw, because what we shouldn't do is to undertake unilateral action from inside of Europe that is not complying with the strategy with the strategic choice of the European Union. So I know what we shouldn't do, but I am really critical about this step of a government in Warsaw, because this is not really in line with at least declared strategy of European. This is easier to say what we shouldn't do in Brexit case on our side and what we shouldn't do in Iranian case than to find constructive, positive solution of how to deliver what was promised to Iranian people. What was promised to Iranian people was the big opening. They were not thinking much about nuclear deal. They were expecting a new opening in their life, especially younger generation. And really, we cannot, in a magic way, deliver that promise to them.
Right, yes. Mr. Ambassador, what are exactly the interests of the EU to preserve the deal, but also what are the interest of the Iranian to preserve it as well?
It's a very interesting question, coming back to the one you just asked about. I think behind this whole interrogation lies a very strong difference of assessment of what is the political situation in Iran. Namely, is there really a moderate line or not? And we some have doubts about this. Other observers will say no, this has been there for a very long time. I'm not here talking about the young generation, because I totally agree with what has just been said. From what we can gather, the young generation is really looking for the opening of the regime. But is there a staunch radical group against a more moderate one? It's very difficult to say. The only thing, I think, from a purely factual point of view that one can say is that it's interesting that nearly 1 year after the American decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, Iran is still on board. One could have accepted that they would immediately withdraw, and they have decided not to. And one can hear from the statement you just mentioned a few moments ago, that there seems to be some sort of struggle inside the regime, precisely. Is it fake news just to play with the Western countries? I don't know. But the reality is still that Iran has remained on board.
Yes.
And I think that is interesting. What is the interest of the Europeans? Once again, I can only repeat what I was saying before. We all think that, once again, this deal needs to be protected and needs to go on, because we think that by a way or another we need to set up a dialogue, realistic dialogue with Iran, knowing exactly where the problems are and not being naive with the
Yes.
Iranians. But to start a dialogue with them to see if we can slowly bring more stability in the region rather than just staying put and looking at the growing confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the kind of diplomatic role that other countries like Turkey or the Emirates are trying to play. This is not good, and it's not good for European interests because
Okay.
this is a neighborhood, a very close neighborhood. We have a lot of economic, political, cultural relations with them, and therefore we need to play as much as we can a role in that area in order to bring stability. Now, of course, it's difficult, and we all know that, but way of rebuilding trust, because that's really the problem between all these different countries in the region, in my opinion, is precisely to go exactly the other way that we are witnessing at the moment, is to stick to that agreement, to look at areas where we could build some progress. You start to have something with regard to the Yemen crisis, the Yemen conflict. This is where the Europeans have tried to set up a political dialogue with Iran. Will it bring some fruit? I don't know, but it's interesting to see that maybe on bits and pieces like that, one could make some progress.
Okay, yeah, right. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah. So, Mrs. Ernst, do you think that the EU can remain connected commercially, diplomatically, and so on with Iran?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think we should try it. There are a lot of tasks. If you look in the economy, not only of Iran, also from the whole region, there are a lot of points we have to discuss. We have to discuss about energy policy. I think it's important for us Europeans. It's not only a question of a deal, of a business. It's also a question of the development of a whole region. Or we speak about drug policy. We could speak in Iran often about that. There is a museum and documented a lot of efforts to fight against drug trafficking, and this is a very, very big point where we can have bring in the discussion a lot of experiences from Europe especially. And you know that the drugs arrive with us from Afghanistan and other countries. And social questions, yes, okay, one of the most important points are social questions in Iran. It's true. The drivers were striking because they didn't got a salary. And we know the situation of the women. We know the situation of a lot of families are very, very poor, especially in the rural areas, and there is no connection, or not much a connection, between social struggle and the struggle for freedoms rights. This is very divided. You could see it in the last years, and it's a long way where we can give a lot of experiences from Europe, and this is an important point for stability in this region, in Middle East. And maybe we have different positions and different ideas. What is the Middle East for the Western countries? For Europe, we are neighbors. I told it, we are really neighbors. We should know what will be happen in the next years in this region. And for the US, it's another thing, transmission belt for own interests, American first, and we know that. And I think this is this brings a lot of imbalances in this region. But yes, again, I think we should try it. We should look what is possible. What is possible in this situation to come to trade and with Iran, but it's not easy. I know.
Could I just add one point to one other success I think we have seen recently with Iran, which for me is a very good example that you can have a very tough position with Iran and have and still have a dialogue with them was the whole issue of money laundering. You know that the financial experts from IMF, etc., were very angry with the lack of rigor on behalf of the Iranian authority with the whole issue of money laundering.
Yes.
So we had asked the Iranians to come up with national legislation on that issue. They did. It went through the parliament, and at the last moment, what I would call the radical wing decided to get rid of that legislation. And the international community said, no way. If you don't go along and adopt up to its final stage this legislation, we will not be able to go on doing business with your financial sector. And they have adopted that money laundering legislation a few days ago. This is a small step. It's not much. It has nothing to do with human rights. But in the fight against terrorism, and we know that we have a lot to say to the Iranians about this, this is a step in the right direction.
Okay.
This is not the end of a history in Fukuyama terms. So we should somehow respect cultural differences. This is proud civilization. They believe that they are longer civilization than the European one. But we can influence only small steps, only stops. But to influence domestic developments, we need dialogue. You cannot influence via stick only, via sanctions. Both sanctions and carrots, opportunities are needed, but we cannot expect Western type of democracy in Iran. This is illusion.
Not yet.
This is illusion. This is not the end of a history in our on our terms. But stick and carrot is a solution also in dealing with a former communist country. This was the way of influencing situation. Some developments in Poland or in Czechoslovakia at that time.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Are there any questions?
Advice?
Yes, advice and solutions, of course.
Yeah, better.
Yes?
But my question is a little bit different from that. Sorry. Okay. I have two questions. By the way, my name is Sima. I'm from European Neighbourhood Council and a communications assistant on behalf of ENC. So my first question is, what are the main obstacles on the special purpose vehicle on Iran? And my second question is, has the special purpose vehicle found a location for its potential headquarters?
Okay, fine. Any other? I think you, yeah.
My name is Colin Forber. I'm with Project Associates. My question relates to the fact that much of the actual reticence amongst the various other actors in the region towards the JCPOA has been towards the freedom that they perceive it gave Iran in order to pursue their foreign policy goals in other theaters. Monsieur Vimont mentioned Yemen as being one of the main points of contention. Considering that, if the EU did manage to create a carrot to accompany the current stick, to what extent do you think the EU would be able to effectively wield those in order to be able to encourage better behavior from Iran in terms of the actual conflicts within the region?
All right.
On the special purpose instrument, the difficulty is that if you are a European bank or a European company that's going to be involved into that special instrument, and that the Americans come out loudly and clearly saying that anyone who is getting involved into that instrument will not be able to do any more business in the US, and furthermore is violating the whole sanctioned regime, and therefore if ever you put a footstep in America, you'll go to the court. And that makes a very strong argument for most of the banks, companies, and whatever, just to stay out of this. And this is, in fact, what is happening at the moment. A lot of financial establishments, enterprise, are looking at this with great caution, even to the point where some of the member states that have been contacted or approached in order to be the seat of that special instrument, because you have to set up a company to be the seat for that instrument, have simply refused to do so because they fear some retaliation on the American side. And if you talk today with many of the Treasury officials walking around Europe at the moment, they will tell you that they're watching very carefully and will take all the necessary action to prevent that instrument from developing itself. So at the end of the day, you may have this instrument, but it will maybe work on a very low profile for a very little amount of business at the moment, and we will see how it goes.
All right.
On the second question that was raised, I raised the issue of Yemen because, interestingly enough, Yemen is in fact a place where Iran was not as much involved as it is in Iraq or in Syria, and therefore there is maybe some room for maneuver there, some possibility of leverage. And the truth is, this is one of the very few crises, if not the only one, where for the time being the UN special envoy has managed a little bit of breakthrough. We all hope, I touch wood, that he will succeed in moving ahead. But if you look at Libya, if you look at Syria at the moment, special envoys of the UN are having great difficulty. Here, a little bit of progress has appeared. So this is why I was saying maybe more could be done. But I want to take your question in a larger context, and taking up what was just said a few minutes ago about don't expect to change the culture and the political culture of Iran. Don't expect to change the perception of Iran with regard to the whole region and its own security in the region. You know, we look at Iran as a hostile partner, and to some extent I think it's right. But think about what they think also when they look at Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. They fear themselves that they are surrounded by threats for their own security, and therefore this has to be taken into account when you discuss with them. It's very easy, and in the kind of agenda that we have set up with regard to Iran, the ballistic missile program, the influence of Iran in Syria and Iraq, etc., it's all, of course, very strong push by Western countries, even the European countries, which feel very uncomfortable with this ballistic missile program, for all the reasons that were put rightly so a few minutes ago in the question. So we have this strong agenda because we perceive Iran as being hostile and not being friendly. But Iran has exactly the same perception with regard to all its partners in the region. And so I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to be naive, that we have to accept that. No, but we have to take that into account if we want to have a meaningful dialogue. You only have a dialogue when you start understanding what the other side thinks. If you want to impose your views, you'll never go very far. This is what it's all about when you're talking about diplomacy. It's you have to listen and to hear what the other one is saying. If you don't listen, of course, you can put time and again your arguments on the table, but you will go nowhere. So this is really what we need to start doing with Iran at some stage, as we need to do it with Saudi Arabia, which has its own arguments and very good arguments, or Israel or Turkey or the Emirates or others. But we have to get into that kind of new mindset. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
Mm-hmm. I think you have another question.
I have a question to you. One of my big questions is SPV. Wherever instruments, such an instrument in the history, is it a new instrument, or is it have we some good examples that we say, okay, we should do it in this way or this way? I don't know.
No, I mean, if you go back, this is was done 300 years ago in terms of I sell you my food and you sell me your cotton or whatever, which were.
Barter system.
Barter. This is exactly it. Now it's a sophisticated barter today because we're trying to play also with financial instruments. But mostly the logic of this is bartering.
It's bartering, yes.
As for the business opportunities in relationship with Iran, I think even without decision of Trump administration, from the very beginning, the bottleneck was the banking system. From the very beginning.
This is a problem, yeah.
And this is even more when you try with creative solutions. But there is also one major obstacle on the Iranian side, apart from banking, that is the control of economy by this revolutionary guards. And
That's true.
That is why, to some extent, this economic system is corrupted. And even if we deliver something, but it's not necessarily coming to people because the revolutionary guard is somehow controlling it and grasping it. So these two, that is. But you cannot influence domestic situation in Iran towards more moderate without dialogue. The stick is not enough. Sanction is not. I think in this dialogue, only sanctions, that is something absolutely counterproductive. And this is my final, and I am leaving.
For me, it's also a problem the structure of the Islamic Republic. If we discuss it, the economic infrastructure is not in the hands of the state or Hani. We have the special role of the revolution guards and revolution leader. You have no transparency. Okay, it's true. You don't know, is it a good company, can I deal or not? These are really problems also for entities in Europe and the member states too. This is what is open. This is open for me. Is this regime reformable or not? I don't know. I cannot give an answer. But this is the one point. The other point is to try it. To try it and to try it.
Okay.
Yeah. I just put the questions because we're just discussing. What do you think after the recent events concerning Saudi Arabia, who shows also a quite ugly face? And you know the question of human rights and women's rights and situation of and the aggressivity of Saudi Arabia. You mentioned the case of Yemen. Do you think that the recent events could have some influence in the relation we could have with Iran from our European perspective and European interest to try not to have double standards? I noticed that some government like Germany decide to stop, for example, sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. In which extent you see some action or some consequences?
First of all, it's very difficult to know exactly the impact of. You were alluding to the Khashoggi affair,
Yeah.
to the sort of let's call it breakthrough or suddenly this change of attitude in Yemen. It's difficult to know exactly how it works. Saudi Arabia is a very secret regime, so it's difficult to see how exactly did the pressure from Washington, from the Congress, have some impact. But secondly, you're absolutely right on your broader question. Could we have a sort of united position, not only from the European Union, but from the Western countries? Think about Canada, which is taking a very strong stance with regard to human rights in Saudi Arabia, and also between the European Union members. Of course, that would be great, and that is what European foreign policy should be all about. But we know that this is a difficult task.
Have to go too. Okay.
We'll stay.
Okay.
More questions?
So, what could be the future of the EU-Iran relations in your point of view?
This is a big question. It needs courage from the Europeans and more transparency from the Iranians. For me, it's a big question, how reformable is this system there? Can I come to a closer cooperation or not? It's open, it's really open. But I think we have no possibility to think about a breakout or what. We as Europeans should try to cooperate and to look forward. Also because of the opposition in this country, and we have opposition in this country in jail, Nasrin Sotoudeh, yes, we have done a lot in the last weeks. It's impossible to have this person in a prison. And we have also discussed about the human rights dialogue. It's very, very, very heavy. It's a big task because the Iranians day by day say, yes, and what is with the US and what is with the violation of human rights in this and this countries. That's true, but I think we have no alternatives. We should try it, and I'm a little bit not so pessimistic like my colleague Lewandowski, Mr. Lewandowski, Janusz Lewandowski. I think we have a strong civil society there. This is, for me, is it hopeful. We have more civil society than in other countries there in this region, and we should give them a hope. This is more or less, yeah.
Right. Are there any questions for that? No?